Well, thank you, Steve, for that marvellous introduction. So hello, partners, hello, clients. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. I feel like a couple of news anchors, actually. We are very excited to be able to show you the exclusive first look at the key findings and insights from National Clearance Survey. I know the Research and Insights team, as Steve said, have been incredibly busy behind the scenes, scouring through all those responses so we can have this first peek, this exclusive first peek at what the data is telling us, and then share that with our clients and partners. So just to give you a run through of how today is going to go. So me and Nat are going to take you through firstly the context of sort of clearing for 2021, what happened, what the numbers were telling us, and then go into a bit more of a deep dive into the actual National Clearing Survey results themselves, and what that tells us and how we can then use that to influence marketing strategy and planning for the year ahead. Then we're going to have some questions on that, and then a little break before we then go on to the 10:30 session where Alex, Nat and Kat are going to take you through the Kira Data Labs and look at how we can access and manipulate the data for partners, and then a wider look at how we can use the Kira Data Labs to inform marketing strategy as well. So just some quick introductions. You probably all know me from being on webinars weekly, I think for the past 2 years, but I'm Nick Wilmer. I'm Head of Education. Especially my role today in the webinar is sort of looking at what the data is telling us, what the insights are telling us, and then how we can help you, our clients, turn that into better marketing strategy going into next year. Over to you now.
And I'm Nat Gould. I'm the senior researcher here at Native, so I'm involved in everything research. So I've been involved in writing, running the survey and analysing the National Clearing Survey data.
Brilliant. Okay, so I am going to set a bit of context here. So if we cast our minds back to A-Level Results Day 2021, which feels like years ago now, let's just remind ourselves of where we were and where students were at that time as well. So we had teacher assessed grades had been announced relatively early in the cycle, so we knew it wasn't going to be the same thing that happened in 2020. Certainly students were more prepared and ready for results, and kind of knew what to expect to a certain degree. So it felt like there was a lot more planning and sort of thought going into it, sort of coming up to A-Level Results Day. The 18-year-old demographic was on the rise for the first time, which was exciting for everyone. So there was more prospective traditional school leavers coming into the demographics and coming into clearing potentially as well. We had seen that this sort of rise year on year of both the direct to clearing students and also the mature numbers coming through as well. And there was an expectation that number would carry on again. We were certainly all feeling the pinch of Brexit sort of half a year through across everything. I'm not sure if supermarket shelves were emptying at that stage. But we knew, but the application numbers for EU applicants in particular had taken a nosedive in sort of leading up to it. So yeah, so it was what a time to be alive, really. The lockdown had also ended 2 weeks before in the UK as well. So there was almost a level of optimism and happiness. And I remember thinking back, and I certainly was looking at clearing and sort of forecasting what was going to happen, expecting this, very, very busy time with lots of students across all the different demographics, throwing themselves into clearing, wanting to go back, go into university and have this big upheaval. If we actually look at the numbers though, that didn't happen. The total applicants placed on A-Level Results Day was 2% decrease on 2020, and that does take into account the EU students and the drop there. Actually, the UK domiciled students was up year on year for the total applicants placed. But when you looked at clearing in particular, so the applicants placed in clearing, there was a 33% decrease year on year, and the direct to clearing placed applicants was 41% down year on year. So a massive drop off year on year in the number of students who were taking up places post A-Level Results Day. So yeah, definitely yeah, my forecast was wrong. That's the best way of looking at it. And it was, yeah, it was a bit of a surprise. And certainly on the day of clearing, when we were sat there, there was almost like a quietness and a calmness that was happening, which hadn't happened before. So it was an interesting time for everyone and something new. So if we just, what I'm going to do now is just take us into a bit more of a deep dive into what happened. So here we've got all placed applicants through clearing across all the different age groups, and just looking sort of year-on-year comparisons. So you can see here, looking at the graph, sort of the first few days after clearing, so up to probably day 4, trends were following relatively similar to what we'd seen before in terms of number of students that were coming through, but still below sort of previous years. And it certainly was sort of quiet on the sort of 2 days after A-level results day as well. But then after day 4, you do see this this tail off, almost like a flat line, where the gap between year on year and applicants, placed applicants coming through from clearing, seemed to grow and grow. So even though it's only 1.4% down, sort of 4 days afterwards, actually, when you get to the end of the 28-day window, we were actually 32.8% down. So yeah, quite a big gap there in terms of total clearing applicants and placements coming through. If you then break that, look into the details, you can see that that collapse in EU applicants during the clearing window definitely had a big impact on that. We did see modest rises in the non-EU, so international students outside the EU. And when you go into the data as well, even though it's not massively significant, but you can tell that there is also a widening disparity between those higher participation regions and lower participation quintiles as well. So that gap between those two has definitely grown a bit, or at least one's grown faster than the other as well. So so what I want to do now is just go through and look at each of those and in a bit more detail. So let's look at here the traditional versus the mature. Again, the traditional side, you can see that sort of following the pattern up to 3 or 4 and then tailing off is similar to the overall, because the larger student numbers are there. But if you then look at the mature applicants, again, just a lot quieter and a lot fewer numbers coming through than we certainly were expecting, and certainly coming through, sort of taking up placements. And then you can see towards the end of that graph on the right hand side, there's the classic sort of uptick 20 days afterwards, which we do see, with the mature student demographic. A lot of mature students do take places right up to sort of final dates before course starts. So that's not to be unexpected, but I think it's just interesting to show how both demographics in different sets were down. On to the next slide, please. And then, focusing on those routes to clearing. So, how were students approaching and coming to clearing, and what were the differences? So, sort of main scheme clearing students, so look sort of 4% up, but actually, those placed in clearing through main scheme was down 31%. Adjustment was massively up 111%, and then sort of place with firm choice was relatively similar, sort of 5%. But then some of the big differences there, you've got this the direct to clearing students were again down 38%, and which left us with this big pool of both traditional and mature and direct students who were almost registered, free to be placed, and we were expecting them to take up a place and get in touch, and that certainly didn't happen. So looking at some of the reasons why, I mean, that this was a time when teacher assessed grades came in, and I'm not going to use the term grade inflation because I don't like it at all, but because of that decision to teacher assessed grades, we did have significantly increased grades for both 2020 and 2021. And what happened was that a lot more students got into their first choices, or were able to go through adjustment and upgrade and go to a higher tier university or a different university than the one they originally chose. So you saw a lot more people going through that route. And then what happened was, because all those top clearing places were filled, And there was almost this percentage of clearing potential clearing students who would have gone through clearing normally were taken out of the running. So the overall numbers of those who would normally go through clearing certainly diminished, which I think then led to the quietness and the overall number of students coming through in those sort of first days and then sort of finally as well. And that also then led to, you know, if you actually go on to the next slide, looking at those free to be placed students, you know, looking at year on year, especially in 2021, there's this huge uptick in sort of the number of students who you're expecting, you know, some of them to come through and take up places. So I was interested in this demographic because I wanted to know, you know, what age group that was, what demographic that was, and why they weren't taking up places. So we did a little bit of analysis on looking at, you know, age groups, and you can see there are some traditional students in there, sort of that younger 18 demographic, but certainly when you get to 21 plus, so the mature student audience, you can see in 2021 a large, you know, chunk of those free to be placed students were mature students. So I think at this stage it's fair to say that there was lots of students who were available, who could have gone through clearing at this stage, but decided not to. And that could well be because they decided against it and they wanted to, you know, stick with family work commitments. It could well be there's a supply and demand issue, and actually the courses that, you know, they wanted to go for weren't available. So what was on offer wasn't quite what they wanted, and therefore they made a decision not to go forward. So there was this imbalance, and which led to lots of students sort of not finally taking up places. Next slide, please. So how did that affect different tiers and tariffs of universities? So sort of historically looking back and looking at lower tariff providers, they would take up, you know, a large market share of those clearing students, and that's sort of traditionally been the way, which has been closing over the years, certainly sort of leading up to 2020, where suddenly you see this flip, where, and going into 21, that change definitely becomes more exaggerated. So there's higher tariff providers actually taking up a larger market share of the clearing students, and then leaving sort of lower tariff universities behind a little bit, with gaps to fill. And then, yeah, I suppose sort of looking forward into how we go about it, depending on what happens with exams in 2022 and whether or not grades are going to start coming down again. That will have an impact on how this looks going into next year. Yes, the cliff edge of EU students, obviously a very sad time for all of us. Down by a staggering 56% since 2020. But again, there is positives there from non-EU. So Brexit had also had an impact on EU students, as you can imagine it would, but didn't have major impact on, you know, on countries and students from outside of the EU who still want to come to the UK. On the next slide, we've actually got a breakdown of those international markets. So for this, we've got two different axes. So one axis is around short-term growth, so year-on-year growth, and one is on long-term growth, so looking back over the past sort of 5-6 years. And then mapping that out into different quadrants. So you can see a lot of the EU countries, unsurprisingly, in that bottom left-hand quadrant. So we're seeing shrinkage across that and decreases. But actually, looking at the international growth on the top right, and also the size of the circles here shows the volume of students. You can see that China and India are the outliers in terms of size of you know, students coming into the UK through clearing. And obviously, you know, are two of the biggest international student recruitment markets, in particular India, which is obviously growing and growing, actually catching up in terms of numbers. But I think interestingly here, there are countries there that are some more traditional recruitment countries and some that sort of newcomers as well. So the likes of Turkey, United Emirates, US and Canada, Nigeria, certainly all countries to focus on and look at when it comes to 2022 strategy for international teams. Because if those continue to grow in that same way, definitely ones to focus on for next year. On to the next slide, please. Okay, so finally, I wanted to look at some of our own data and just do a little bit of a deep dive into how students were feeling on results day. So we've used our own tool, Student Pulse, which is our monthly newswire that goes to undergraduate and postgraduate students. But here we've looked at prospective undergraduate students around the time of clearing to understand what they were going through. On to the next slide. That picture paints 1,000 words. So yeah, looking at here, so sort of some of the sort of key things that we pulled out from the data about what students were going through. So the course on offer, the career opportunities were certainly the most important factors when it came to choosing a university around that time. Confidence in academic performance was a major barrier. So there's definitely sort of stress and anxiety around whether they would get the grades they needed to in order to go to universities. And that was 4 in 10 prospective students sort of shared that anxiety. And then finally, sort of stress about academic performance was negatively impacting the well-being of 1 in 2 students. So half of the students were feeling very, very stressed out, which I think why we've chosen that particular picture to go on that slide. And here you can see how stress levels have changed over the years. So no major surprises here when we look at sort of July up to August when the exam results have come out. You can see that big spike going into A-level results and what's happened. So, and then actually that continues through September and October as well. So there's still been high levels of stress, even though students may well have got the place as well. So just good to know that it's not a spike. Actually, there's continued concern sort of leading up as well. So definitely a time to think about how you're supporting prospective students who've made their choice and who are coming to university, especially when it comes to looking at making sure that we're avoiding dropout and retention. On to the next slide. So I thought this one was interesting. So looking at year 2020 to year 2021 and what those barriers were and what the sort of concerns were for prospective students going to university. And one of the key factors we pulled out here is that the 33% increase in students stating that mental health is a barrier to attending university in 2021. So that has increased year on year. Obviously, we've gone through a very difficult 2 years, and we know that has affected everyone's mental health. But specifically for the student demographic, it is something that is continuing to be a problem, but a growing concern as well. I know later on we're going to talk more around some of the findings we've got from National Clearance Survey and how that affects it. Okay, so on to the final slide. Yeah, I just wanted to summarize all of that and look and do a little bit of forecasting going into 2022. So as I said there, the mental health does continue to be a challenge, certainly for current students. So we're finding that from our surveys and from our research, but also for prospective student audiences as well. So I think the level of it's about providing support. It's about having the services, but from the findings as well, we know that students aren't able to access or don't know how to access mental health services at university, especially prospective students who aren't on campus and who aren't got access to that data. So I think there's definitely work to do around how, through messaging, through comms, and through support messages, how we can help support and signpost students to the relevant services they need before they even get on campus to try and help and alleviate those worries and concerns before they start. We are going into a world of more controlled data privacy, which I think is a good thing, but it does have impact on how we market and how we advertise. There's when Google takes away third-party cookies away from Chrome in the next couple of years, we're going to be in a world where we don't have access to remarketing lists and third-party cookies. So we definitely will need to pivot, and it should be something we're doing now to capture quality opted-in data, so we can use that as the remarketing and nurture strategy going forward. Also thinking about how we advertise and how we target, again, sort of targeting limitations across Facebook and, you know, through iOS updates are having an impact on how we target specific groups of students. So how we move to contextual advertising and sort of changing the way we look at targeting specific demographics and groups will change. So something to bear in mind for planning strategies for 2022. Then we looked there at sort of local mature audiences. We'll come on to it later when we look at some of the distances that students are willing to travel, but there's certainly a separating out traditional and mature and direct students and them having quite different demographics and behaviours leading up to clearing and then post and when they start. So making sure that we are separating those out and segmenting them and having variant strategies for both traditional and mature. Looking at some of those international markets and obviously this is looking at an overview of the international markets, but looking at your own international markets and student growth and comparing that to the data and seeing if there's any opportunities there for moving into a new market where competitors taking market share. That's going to be key for going into 2022. Also for next year, and I'm going to try and forecast again, and I'm sure I'll get it wrong again, but if teacher assessed grades don't happen next year, and that is an if, because they weren't meant to happen this year, but they did, and we do go back to some form of exams, in theory, the grades will come down. We have more 18-year-olds coming into the market again. Therefore, it should be a busier clearing than certainly the one we had in 2021. I don't think we'll go back to full exams. I think there'll be almost like a gradient as we go back down, giving students more access to what's going to be the content and giving them more guidance. So we have a more gradual return and bringing the grades down to sort of normal levels before the pandemic. But it is going to be massively key if we do have that uptrend in students coming through to clearing, and that we're building audiences now. You're building that connection and building your brand equity with both traditional and mature students early on in the cycle, getting out there and building that connection, and then making sure that you're again spending enough during clearing and during A-level results day. I think it's going to be important. There you go. There's my predictions. We'll read this in a year's time. We'll see if I get them right or not. Fantastic. Okay, and I think that's everything from me. I'm going to hand over to Nat now.
Thanks, Nick. So just wanted to start by talking about what's new this year, and this is going to be the focus of the second half of the session, so we'll talk a lot more about this later on. But for anyone who partnered with us in the NCS this year, you're going to get access to our new dashboard. So we really want to be able to kind of democratize the access to NCS data. So these dashboards contain the data from the last 4 years of NCS. There's loads of clever ways you can manipulate the data, have a look at kind of your own data compared to the sector, also do lots of comparisons, filters. We're really excited about it, so we're excited to show you that later on. But as I said, that'll be the focus of the second half of the session. Okay, so just to start with talking about the sample this year. So we had over 2,500 responses to the survey. That's down on last year, but that, as Nick explained earlier on about the kind of applicants placed in clearing, that kind of makes sense given what happened this year. We had 43 partners taking part who sent the survey out, so that was fantastic. So 3 in 20 of those partners were Russell Group, and 3 in 5 were post-92 institutions. And the survey represents 113 institutions. So we've got students going to lots of institutions included in the survey this year. Just some demographics overall. So average age of respondents for 2021. We can see average UCAS points there, 118, and gender, we've got 64% female. So quite representative of student population in general. And then on the map there, you can see roughly where in the UK they are coming from. And to talk through personas, so for most of you, these will be fairly familiar because you've taken part or seen the National Clearing Survey before, but every year we check these, we check if there are any new emerging personas, and there weren't any, so this year we're sticking with the same ones, so they've kind of stood the test of time. So we've got our traditional clearing students, so typically they'll enter the clearing process having not secured one of their original choices, or they get lower than expected grades. We've then got our direct applicant who apply directly through clearing, so they don't apply during the original UCAS cycle. We've got mind changers, so these people have decided either they want to change their subject, they want to change their institution, or they want to change the location they're going to study in between that original UCAS cycle and clearing. And then we've got the adjustment student who have gone through clearing because they achieved better grades to be expected. And so those are our four personas that we'll refer to throughout the presentation and in the dashboard. So just looking at how our segment market share has changed over the years. So this is just in terms of the sample of people taking part in the National Clearing Survey. So we can see this year we've got fewer traditional clearing students than we have had previously in the survey. And we've kind of got a similar amount of direct applicants, but this time we've got more direct applicants in there than we've got traditional. We see a little bit of an increase there in the mind changer and a bit of an increase there in the adjustment student. And so that is kind of how the demographics changed over the years of the National Clearing Survey. So we've brought together just some highlights from the kind of different profiles. Obviously, there is a wealth of data to look into for each of these. So these are just summaries, and there are quite a few similarities across the profiles, and then lots of differences that you can get into when you delve more into the data. So just to give a couple of things here about the traditional clearing students. So they make up 32% of our sample, and they are finding things like entry requirements are a barrier, cost of living, mental health. And then if we move on to the next slide, please. And then 52% of them are doing no research ahead of results day, which perhaps isn't so surprising if they don't expect to get lower grades. And then we can see there that teachers, school, friends and parents and guardians are the top influences. We can move on to the direct applicant. So the direct applicant makes up 34% of our sample. They're older, so 23 is the average age. We can see there that cost of tuition, mental health and cost of living are their top barriers. And also more of them are doing no research ahead of results day, and with university staff being more influential for this profile. The mind changer, so we can see that takes up 23% of our sample. Again, things like cost of living, entry requirements, mental health are coming up as top barriers to going to university for this group. And around half of those are doing no research ahead of results day, and university staff, friends and parents and guardians are the top influences. And finally, our adjustment students, so a smaller kind of 6% of our sample. Again, similar barriers really, cost of living, mental health, confidence for these guys as well. And we've got similar influences, so parents, guardians, friends and teacher and school. So as I said, the top line, some of those things are quite similar across the profiles, but once you delve kind of further into that data, we'll see lots of differences that come out, and there'll be lots of things that you can explore kind of within the dashboard to see actually if there's particular parts that you're really interested in kind of getting down to that finer grain into detail. It will all be there for you to have a play with. So as Nick mentioned, we see that there's been kind of that drop off, that gap for mature students in terms of being placed this year, and also an increase in international students. So we wanted to just have a look, take the opportunity to look at those audiences within our survey and see what they're telling us, because we're able to get an idea of kind of the behaviours and motivations that are going on for those audiences from our sample. So firstly, we're going to take a look at international clearing students versus domestic students. So these are non-EU students. So what we see here is that, so this is all in comparison to what domestic students are telling us. So course ranking, more important for international students. Cost of tuition, distance to travel and COVID-19 are bigger barriers than they are for domestic students. Business studies and economics are more likely to be their subject of choice. Teachers in school and college are more influential. And they begin their research, tend to begin earlier, so starting from June and July this year. And they follow a similar timeline once they're looking to secure a place as the domestic students. Top social media platforms are similar, so Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, but they actually use Instagram and Snapchat less in terms of daily use, whereas they use YouTube more in terms of daily use. So just some interesting differences there that we picked up in our sample.
I'm going to jump in now. Can we go back to the international slide, please? Sorry, I can't help myself.
No, give me a break.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I like segmenting up the NCS data in different ways, and I think it's the first time we've done it for international, so I think it's really interesting. I think all those points on there definitely ring true with an international audience. You know, from the work we do and the research we do, that definitely paints a picture around what an international student is. But I would say that, you know, the world is a big place as well, and even though some of these are true and certainly can be applied to lots of countries and lots of segments within countries, it's definitely worth, you know, as you approach international markets, to know that, you know, that those countries do differ in terms of what's most important to them, you know, and what those influences are, and certainly when it comes to platforms as well, and country-specific platforms as well. So, yeah, doing the research, working with your research and insights teams, working with agencies, you know, and working with agents in market as well, can tell you a lot about how to approach it and what matters the most. But I think it's a really good way of separating out that data.
And then we also want to look at mature clearing students versus traditional. When we say traditional, that's traditional age rather than traditional profile. So not surprisingly, probably these are much more likely to be a direct applicant. So I think around 60% of them are direct applicants in our survey. Cost of tuition is a bigger barrier for this group compared to traditional age. They're more likely to be influenced by university staff, and they either begin their research and decision making really early, or much more drawn out. So there was kind of two polar opposites on that graph, between the start and the end of the cycle. So interesting that they're either really early in their research or late to start thinking about clearing places. And for them, we see slightly different social media platforms. So Instagram, YouTube, but we see Facebook appears here for mature clearing students, compared to traditional, which is in line with what we see in a lot of research that we do here at Natives. Yeah.
Yeah, I get a bit obsessed about the mature clearing students. I don't know why. I focus a lot on it. And I did that breakdown and sort of segmentation of the direct applicant. And the mature student audience was certainly an interesting one, because actually, you know, from a 21-year-old up to like a 40-year-old, there's so much variance in that prospective student. You've got you think around, especially like, look at the social media platforms they use. Like you said, Facebook becomes ever increasingly more used as you approach someone of my age, for example, who still uses Facebook, whereas someone who's 21, you know, wouldn't be on that spectrum. So if you're targeting a mature audience, I think it's important to think around that variance and actually possible segments within there, and you know, course specific promotion that might appeal to certain demographics within the mature audience, and definitely things like, you know, cost of tuition, the fact that mature students are more likely to be balancing family and work commitments as well, looking for sort of local providers, looking for sort of vocational career based courses as well, and yes, the timings that are definitely the most drawn out around A-level results time. Most mature students don't even get involved or do anything during that time. It's very much early on, and then it's long tail effect going up to September start. So yeah, a very different strategy needed for mature clearing students. But again, sorry, I get obsessed with that bit.
Yeah, and as you said, that's kind of just some top line stuff, but actually in the dashboard you'll be able to segment that yourself and have a look at certain questions that you're interested in to see where that's different. So again, something that we'll be able to be do with the dashboard this year.
So before we go on to key findings, I just wanted to say, if anyone does want to ask any questions through the portal as well, by all means ask them throughout the presentation, and we'll catch them right at the end.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so we're going to move on to just some key findings. So these are just some initial kind of insights, things that we find interesting. I guess with this kind of data, there are always so many things you could find interesting, and everyone will look at it with different things to pick out. So we just wanted to pick out some of the ones that we think are really interesting this year. So our first key finding is looking at the radius that clearing students are willing to travel from home is shrinking. So we've seen that there's been a decrease in distance, so 12% decrease in the distance that they're willing to travel from home since 2018. And we want to look a little bit more into that. Next slide, sorry. So we asked students what's a barrier to going to university, and 1 in 3 clearing students say that distance to travel is becoming a larger barrier to entry, and that's changed over the years and becoming more of a barrier. We've seen that across the years changing. And in terms of importance, so when we ask kind of, what are you looking for when, what's important when you're making a decision about where to go? So location has increased 10% in terms of importance over the last 3 years. And when we delve into kind of how do you decide who to contact when you're narrowing down those choices, and being close to home was the second most important factor, and that was a free text question. So that's kind of what students were telling us they were using in those deciding factors. And this was an interesting question because they could talk about anything here. So being close to home was really on the radar for people. We did have a think about whether this was related to COVID or anything like that, but we don't see COVID having much of an impact this year at all for students. There were obviously a few for which it did, but very few then mentioned anything around distance. What we do see is that distance is even smaller for those who are widening participation, so polar regions. So we see that's down to 44 miles versus the average, which is 51 miles. So even more of a kind of shrinking radius there for widening participation students wanting to stay close to home. And then we also see that that's slightly different per institution type. So we can see that students are more willing to travel further for a Russell Group institution. And we can see there for the different types of institution there what the kind of average miles are that students are willing to travel. So just interesting there to think about kind of where you fit within those institutions and kind of what radius your clearing students might be looking to come from.
Yeah, the radius is interesting. That sort of that shrinking of how far students are comfortable to travel certainly will sort of flow into planning for next year when we are looking at, depending on what kind of organisation you're working for, looking at that as almost like a barrier as to how far we might want to push out to think about capturing potential students. If you have partnered with us as well, I would say this is the time to start looking at your own individual data and how that benchmarks against some of these sort of top line stats that we're looking at here, and whether or not your prospective clearing students are coming from a slightly wider or closer radius. I would also say, sort of taking that the next step, is if you've got access to your own data in terms of applications that have come through from clearing and enrollments that have come through from clearing, and we can help you do this as well. So map this out onto actually look at where applications are coming through and their enrollments are coming through, and if there's any gaps in that as well, because you may well be generating applications with promotion that you're doing but actually not getting the enrollment. So how do we focus on within that radius where the high propensity students are going to come through from? If you want to be even cleverer, we can then overlay that with advertising data as well. So sort of looking at where we're spending money in terms of promotion and where we're getting clicks through, and then where we're getting enrollments from, and almost finding those hotspots of promotion. Essentially, you want to spend money in the right places, but this obviously goes to gives us some good indications that overall trend is shrinking down.
Thanks, Nick. So moving on to our second key finding. So we still see that students are continuing to use a wide variety of channels, and what's really nice about having done the National Clearing Survey over the last few years is we're able to see where those changes are really happening, which allows us to really see kind of which platforms are emerging and which platforms are becoming less popular. And what we've seen is that Instagram remains the highest used, and that's even more so for the kind of traditional young students. So 72% are telling us that they're using Instagram daily. And what we've seen is this huge rise again in TikTok. So we talked about that last year in the National Clearing Survey, but we've seen that's risen again. Now half of students are saying they're using that daily. That's actually even more for those who are of the young demographic, so they actually use that more than YouTube overall in the survey. This maps onto a lot of data that we collect during Student Pulse, as Nick mentioned, Student Pulse earlier. And we recently did a survey asking students what they go to each of these platforms for when it comes to universities. And so TikTok, very much they go there for student-generated content, to get a feel for the campus or a feel for student life, and for lighthearted content or mindless kind of scrolling is what they're looking for from TikTok. So really that kind of lighthearted content is what students are looking for from that platform.
I'm going to jump in there again. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's interesting. The rise of mighty TikTok and on the younger generation. I still can't get into it. No. So I just do dances with nieces and nephews as far as I've got on TikTok. But I think here it's interesting how we think about how we use these channels, because yes, like Nat says, the prospective students are using these channels for different things, but also you've got to take into consideration that the likes of Instagram and Facebook, the targeting possibilities are changing. So we're not able to target younger demographics in the same way we used to be able to, and I think that will continue as well. So it's how you then pivot and use platforms like Snapchat and TikTok that may traditionally have been more brand awareness activity that we did. How do you then turn them into brand awareness plus direct response and generate leads from them? And certainly I know that Snapchat in particular is something that we're using, and the advancement in terms of the facilities about how you can actually advertise through it and capture data is improving very, very quickly. And the same for TikTok as well. So they're definitely not just growing in terms of numbers, but growing in terms of how we use them as platforms. And TikTok itself, I think everyone's over the webinars that we've done and the events we've done, and speaking to students, speaking to people who know how to use TikTok. It's running sort of old-fashioned brand campaigns across TikTok. It's not going to work. It's all about being student-led. It's all about having working with influencers, but influencers that are at your university, that can talk with an authentic voice to prospective students through those channels. That's where we're seeing the most sort of brand engagement, and then obviously using the right sort of tactics and the right facilities to turn that into leads. Sorry, I'm done now.
And we just wanted to show kind of what that looks like over the last 4 years from the dashboard here. So we can see that, you can really see there that growth in TikTok, which kind of was barely being used in 2019 when we first started asking about TikTok. And we can see just in that 2 years what a massive increase that's been. And I think what's really key here is just knowing that these platforms can change so much in such a small amount of time, and really knowing kind of where the different audiences are. Is really important, because we have seen such a huge change there in some of those platforms. And then if we also look at Facebook, so we can see kind of for them the opposite story really to TikTok. So we see, back in 2016 when we first were talking about social media, we saw 66% of people were using them daily. That's now down to 26% in 2021. So interesting that we can see that decrease there, and decrease year on year as well. Last year that was 31%, so slipping a little bit here. But as we mentioned earlier on, this platform is really popular for more mature students, and so it's not writing it off completely. It's just actually if you're looking for younger audiences, they're becoming less and less likely to be active on Facebook.
It's not cool at all, is it?
Yeah,
Facebook anymore. You want to use it more than anything else. Yeah.
I know, shows our age, Nick.
That's it, yeah.
Okay, and then moving into our third key finding. So we're seeing more and more that clearing is becoming an active choice for students. So we found that 1 in 2 students will contact their original institution in clearing. So that's come down from 2 in 3 in 2018. So interestingly, fewer students contacting their kind of original institution. And we see that actually this is true for traditional students, the traditional profile, as much as it is for the other profile. So it isn't just a factor of kind of that traditional, it's not only traditional, this is the same, sorry, for those who are getting lower grades, that they're also not contacting their original institution, which I thought was really interesting. And so highlights that they may not be going back to their original choice, even though they've got lower grades, they might actually be making an active choice to go somewhere else. And so I think that's really interesting to see this year. Equally, 1 in 2 students don't go to the first institution they contact. So there really is that opportunity for you to be gaining these students that they're not necessarily going to the first place they contact, and therefore they are contacting other institutions after that first one. And for some people it will be they don't get an offer, but for other people it will be that they're kind of actively looking at their choices and seeing actually what's out there for them, and not rushing into that decision on the day. We do see that traditional clearing students are contacting fewer institutions, so that's down from kind of almost 4 in 2019 to just 3 in 2021. But equally, that's an opportunity. There are 3 institutions that kind of is the average for how many they are contacting, which shows again there is that opportunity that you can, if you're you've got the right advertising out there, if you've got the right approach on the phones, if you've got the right messaging going out there, that you can still gain those students when they're coming through clearing, which I think is really interesting. Just diving into this a little bit more, so we had 2 questions. So the one on the left there is a free text question, which I talked about a little bit earlier on. So we wanted to ask students how they decide which institutions to contact in clearing. And these were kind of the top answers that we could put together into themes. So for some, it was the availability of the course. So that was the most important thing they were looking for. Others being close to home, course content and rankings. And for some students, it was all about one of those factors. But for others, it really was a kind of process. So it was, first I look for, and I think this was quite a common one, was first I look for, is there availability on the course I want? Then how close is it to home? Then comparing the course content across those institutions to see actually which course do I think best suits me, and then how do the rankings fit in with that, and where do they rank? So some are really doing that comparison and kind of really narrowing down that list in quite a methodical way, which is really interesting. And then in terms of what factors are important to students when they're deciding which institution to study with, so these are all ratings out of 10, so these are the top 4. So we see subject, course content and career prospects, which were the top 3 across all the different profiles. So same things that they're mostly interested in is it the subject I want to make sure I'm doing? How is that subject kind of broken down? What's being taught? What are my career prospects after university? And then this year, access to face-to-face teaching there is also important. And I guess that's not surprising given the last couple of years that we've had, that, you know, looking to find that face-to-face teaching, hopefully. And so we're seeing that in terms of doing research ahead of results day, we're seeing that 42% of students had done some research. That's compared to 20% in 2018, so that's double, although it is slightly down on last year. And interestingly, 24% of those hadn't heard of their institution before results day. So those are of the people who've done research, they hadn't heard of their institution before results day. That's interesting, that's higher than it was back in 2018, and really shows the importance of kind of that clearing period and being present and being there, because some people won't have heard of their institution at all until that day, and the impact you can actually have on that very results day is really interesting.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting part of the findings. I think that it screams 2 things to me. The first thing is the fact that students are not contacting their original institution, which is odd in lots of ways. Like you think that'd be the first thing to do, is go back to the institution you wanted to go to and see if you could find a course that matched what you were looking for, even if you didn't get the grades. But the fact that students are not and just going elsewhere means that they're not as bonded to your brand as an institution as you might think. Just because that, you know, the application's in there and if you've made an offer, and you're the choice for them, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the work ends. Making sure that you're building that brand equity with the students that have chosen you throughout the period, even once they've made that, is really key. So building in nurture strategies and keeping speaking to those students and keep making them want to come to your institution has got to be vital, because if you've done all that work to get the application through and get to that point, to lose that student at that point is I think that's a miss there. So I think there's work to be done around that. I think there's work to be done around generating brand equity and brand awareness early on in the cycle anyway, going into next year, looking at that, making sure that students know about you. If they are going to go elsewhere, there's an opportunity for universities to then take market share and take students away. But if they're only going to 1 or 2 other universities afterwards, and they're not shopping around as much as they used to, then you've got to be front of mind, and you've got to have done that work early on and be speaking to those students, so that if they don't decide to go to their institution, they go to yours. And then, like Nat said, as we go into clearing, I think it's going to be a busier clearing. That's my forecast, which just means that you need to be front and center during that time period, and to be spending enough money to capture the market that you want to capture once you've done the research. So yeah, I think there's lessons to be learned from this.
Yeah, and something else to add up to, which I meant to say, was every year we ask for those students who are doing research before clearing, what are they looking for? And every single year we've seen, and you'll be able to see this later on the dashboard, but what doesn't change is that the top 2 things that people are looking for is simple things. When does clearing open? What's the clearing process? And I think Often the clearing content isn't there before results day or before that lead up. And we know that some students are doing their research really quite early. And actually, if you have content around clearing on your website all year, you'll be the place that comes up when they're searching for those things. You'll be the place that they first see in terms of clearing. And I think really important to help students understand the process, because lots of them want to know before results day what that process is. And I think it's interesting to see that year on year, that's been the top thing that students are looking for when they're doing their research. So
yeah, absolutely. Okay,
just to wrap up there. So in terms of the key findings that we've talked about this morning, and kind of what some recommendations, some broad recommendations might be around that. So the radius clearing students are willing to travel is shrinking. So really, as Nick talked about right at the start, thinking about segmenting your audiences by area, local students being key really to that, relevant specific messaging to affirm your institution as a viable choice for those students. We know they're continuing to use a wide variety of channels, so making sure we've got relevant content on all channels, and really tailoring that messaging to each platform and each audience. So really thinking about how you're using each platform. And then also clearing's an increasingly an active choice for students, as we just said. So clearing content available throughout the entire year and being really proactive in your recruitment is likely to go far when it comes to this active choice for students.
Brilliant, thank you, Nat. My tummy's rumbling.
Yeah,
not having breakfast. That's breakfast seminars for you. Okay, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Sorry for talking over you a lot. Talking, getting obsessed with mature students. But first, I want to say a huge thank you to all our participant institutions and to all the students who filled out the survey as well. There's a lot, like Steve said, there's a lot of work and time from all the people at Natives and everyone who takes part to make this all work. So thank you. But it only works with participation and for people to sign up. And after doing this for especially for sort of 7 years, 6 years that I've been at Natives, we seem to learn more and more, and you refine it, and it gets better. And even though the data is great for the wider sector, I think if you're a participant, there's so much added benefit you get from that as well. And the ability to have your own report, your own dashboard, and your own data, and be able to benchmark that against the sector is something that is hugely valuable. And I spent a lot of time looking at clients' data and benchmarking against sector and pulling out some really interesting findings. And actually, that then influences marketing strategy massively, and impacts on the results we get from clearing spends year on year. So please do participate again. And those of you who didn't participate, please sign up. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And then the next slide, please. That is literally repeating what I just said on the previous slide. So yeah, just making sure, like I said, just repeating it. By signing up, obviously apart from the other benefits, you do have access to your own Data Labs dashboard. You are able to pull out your own segments. You are able to uncover things that you can't with just the raw data. So it is massively important. So please do sign up now if you haven't done already. So we have had a few questions. Thank you very much. Any other questions you want to send through, please do. We had a question around how we use this data to improve effectiveness of advertising. So just going back to that point I made around if you are a partner, I think the real value in this data, but the magic data is the benchmark data and your specific institution data that you've got available. That's where we're going to be able to understand your clearing students, and then where the gaps are and the opportunity is for you as an institution to work out where the students are coming from, where you should be investing advertising efforts, and where you can stop or bring down levels of spend within certain regions or within certain segments that will ultimately have a better impact on ultimate student enrollments and applications that are coming through. I think that's the only way that we can that you can look at it to improve the activity. That's where it's really going to work well.
Just if I could just jump in as well. So obviously some partners you don't get that many students in clearing, or your sample size is quite small in the survey. What's great this year with having the dashboard is that you can create kind of a lookalike audience. So although you may not have a very big sample yourself, you can segment the data to have a look at kind of students that are like yours that come from the other sector data. So there'll be that way to compare a sector to the benchmark that are similar to your students if you don't have a big sample in the survey. So don't feel disheartened if there were very few responses for your actual university. You're still going to be able to do that benchmarking with the dashboard, which is really exciting.
Groundbreaking,
yeah.
I would say. So the next question was, when's the best time to launch advertising activity? And I think, again, we talked about this, but didn't maybe show some of the slides, and I think it's something we can dig into maybe later in the data. But yeah, time frames, I think it will depend on the segment you go after. So if we are looking after those traditional, those traditional students, we talked about the importance of building brand with traditional audiences early on in the cycle, getting out and market early. Don't leave it too late, because the students are thinking about it and ready to go. And then making sure you focus a lot of time and attention and money on a results day and the few days after that. That's going to be huge. Where if you're turning to the mature audiences and the direct audiences, there is different research patterns and behaviours around that. So having a specific strategy for that mature audience, and having sort of always on to a certain extent, but sort of earlier in the cycle, and then later on, a couple of weeks after A-level results day, is how I would split advertising activity, if they're the two segments you are going after as an institution. It's not for everyone.
Yeah, and when we demo the dashboard after the break, we'll actually be able to see some of those timelines. We won't go into a lot of the data, there's way too much there, but you will be able to see how that's presented in the dashboard to be able to really look at those timelines in more detail as well. And
then we had one was, what would be your recommendations for actions I can take between now and UCAS deadline that would help? I know a lot of clients that I'm speaking to and universities that I'm speaking to are trying to pivot away from relying so much on A-level results day and clearing activity that happens sort of leading up to it, and try and drive as many applications now as they can. So I think that's the trend. I think that's what everyone's doing. But I think, again, there's institutions with different levels of spend here and different ability to take market share and drive applications early on. So if you have that option, great, do it now and try and capture as much first party data as possible leading up to the application window, because even if they don't apply and you capture data, you can then use that data later on within the clearing strategy as we hit A-level results day. If you are a smaller institution and you can't spend as much to get applications now, I think you need to be choiceful. You need to know where you're going to go after and which segments to go after. Just targeting a sort of a generic area isn't going to work. You'll waste money and you'll lose out to bigger competitors. So work out where the students who are more likely to apply and more they're coming from early on, and then spend money on that particular segment, and that will set you aside and do wonders for next year. And also thinking about kind of what you're communicating to your prospective students and what you're talking to them about. We've seen in the National Clearing Survey, but if you also use our student polls dashboard, you'll be able to see kind of what prospective students are looking for, what they want to hear more about. And I think, we've seen that mental health, confidence are things that students are worried about when it comes to uni. So even just being able to reassure prospective students how that support happens, and kind of really thinking about what you're talking to prospective students that is really going to hook them then into making you their choice, I think is key as well, thinking about what you're saying to them. Yeah, absolutely. We had one question here around some of the trends we spoke about, like the unwillingness to travel far from home. Is that a COVID effect? I think you answered that before. Really, yeah, so I think we didn't ask directly, so we can only speculate, but we did ask if in the question about why students went through clearing, COVID only came out for a very small percentage of students as one of their reasons for going through clearing this year, and it was a much lower barrier this year than it was last year. And so for those who did say that COVID was a barrier, we asked them kind of to be more specific about that. And there was only a very small percentage who mentioned close to home. So it feels like it's not necessarily a COVID effect, and it feels like it's something kind of potentially more long-term than that. But obviously without directly asking that question, it's only speculative. But. Yeah, and I've only got a speculative answer for this as well. I feel that after going through the 2 years that we went through and wanting to be close to home, there must be, whether it's a direct COVID effect, but just wanting to be close to family, be able to get back home and everything that comes with being isolated and stuck in halls and that kind of stuff, and some of the horror stories we heard. that will have an impact on the psyche in general, and sort of the demographics and the new students that are coming through. And I think that will continue. I mean, we just had the news from Boris yesterday, so there's changes happening already because of new variants coming out, and I think that's going to continue into next year. So I think that will certainly be a concern for prospective clearing students next year, and probably going forward. I think something's going to continue more and more. The likelihood of getting up and going across the country to somewhere else when everything's hanging over our heads certainly will have a resounding impact. So, but again, without knowing the exact data and ask the question, it's difficult to.
So probably a COVID effect, but not specific to COVID times right now, I think.
Okay, I think that's everything. So because we're a little bit ahead of time, what we're going to do is have a quick 5-minute break now. And actually, we're going to start the Akiro Data Labs session with our new panelists at 10:15 instead. Apart from you, sorry, Nat, you can't stay on. So I'm going to leave, but it's been great speaking to everyone. I've really enjoyed that session. Any other questions you want, then please do send them through, either directly to me or to marketing, and we'll be able to come back to you. But for now, I will say goodbye, and we'll be back at 10:15 for the Akira Labs demo. Bye.